Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Radagast the Brown, a mono-green commander from The Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. I've kept the cost of this deck below $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including basic lands at 10 cents each, and, as always, the link to the deck list is in the description down below. Now let's look at this deck. So, Radagast is a 2/5 legendary avatar wizard for 2 generic and 2 green mana, and whenever Radagast or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can look at the top X cards of your library, with X being that creature's mana cost, of which you can reveal a creature card that doesn't share a creature type with one you already control, put it in your hand, and then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So to me, Radagast sounds kind of like the opposite of a tribal commander, as clearly it wants to have a lot of creatures in the deck, but with as little overlap in creature types as you can reasonably manage. And while it does project your hand a little bit, Radagast also provides a bit of draw tempo as, especially for higher mana value creatures, your creatures should frequently be able to replace themselves in your hand. Which brings us to the deck goals of this commander. Overall, this deck has a pretty straightforward game plan. We're going to look to fill a large proportion of this deck with creatures, trying to keep the overlap of creature types to a minimum, so Radagast's ability fails to find a valid creature as little as possible. We'll cast a bunch of creatures, dig down into our deck to get more creatures, and then we'll look to smack our opponents with those creatures, preferably after we've given our creatures something like Trample to make it so we're much more likely to get through, amongst other buffs. That all being said, let's get into our deck's 99, starting with our ramp. Starting with mana rocks, we have Mindstone and Prismatic Lens, mostly for generic mana. Moss Diamond and Decanter of Endless Water will give us some green, with Decanter additionally letting us have no maximum hand size. Then, for some land-based ramp, we have Wayfarer's Bauble and Font of Fertility, both of which can be sacrificed to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. Then we have Rampant Growth and Cultivate, the former tutoring a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and the latter having you search for 2 basic lands, which you reveal, put one onto the battlefield tapped, and the other into your hand. Then, to make our lands even more effective, we have Wild Growth and Gauntlet of Power. Wild Growth enchants a land, and then gives you an extra green mana when said land is tapped for mana. And Gauntlet of Power has you choose a color when it enters the battlefield, so green for us. And then our green creatures get +1/+1, and our green mana tapping lands will give us 2 green mana whenever they're tapped instead of just 1. Finally, given this is a creature-focused deck, we've got some mana dorks with Llanowar Elves, Coppermere, and Ornithopter of Paradise, all of which will give us green. And then there's Mannequin, which taps for generic, and while it doesn't tap for mana, we have Tanuki Transplanter, an equipment creature that, when it or its equipped creature attacks, it gives you green mana equal to the attacking power that you don't lose for the rest of the turn, even while steps and phases end. Now let's dig a bit deeper into our selection of creatures, going over those that don't grant anthems or keyword buffs, as those are in later chapters. First up, we have Deadly Recluse, a low drop 1/2 spider with Reach and Death Touch, Scavenging Ooze, a 2/2 ooze that can be used for some graveyard hate. And if you exile a creature card, Scavenging Ooze gets a +1/+1 counter, and you gain a life. Then we have Ivy Dancer, a 1/2 Dryad Shaman that can be tapped to give a creature Forest Walk for the turn. Up next is Lurgoyf, a Lurgoyf creature with power equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards, and toughness is that +1. Then we have Kura, the Boundless Sky, a 4/4 Flying Death Touch Dragon Spirit that, when it dies, you choose to either search your library for 3 land cards which you reveal and put into your hand, or you make an XX green spirit creature token with X being the number of lands you control. Hornet Queen can make you very unattractive to attack, as it's a 2/2 Flying Death Touch insect that makes 4 1/1 Flying Death Touch green insect creature tokens when it enters the battlefield. Then we have Mistcutter Hydra, a hasty X mana spell that can't be countered, has protection from blue, and enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. And finally for this section, we have Ghalta, Primal Hunger, a 12/12 trampling elder dinosaur that, while the printed mana cost is huge at 12 CMC, Ghalta costs X generic less to cast, with X being the total power of creatures you control. And given we'll have a bunch of creatures, you'll likely be able to cast Ghalta for close to its minimum cost of 2 green mana. Now let's go over the spells that'll give our creatures Trample, starting with Haunted Cloak, an equipment that grants Vigilance, Trample, and Haste with an equip cost of 1. Then we have The Crowd Goes Wild and Storm the Seed Core. The Crowd Goes Wild has support X, having you put a +1/+1 counter on up to X creatures, and then creatures with a +1/+1 counter on them gain Trample until the end of the turn. Storm the Seed Core has you distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among creatures you control, and then your creatures gain Vigilance and Trample for the turn. Then there's Overrun, giving our creatures +3/+3 and Trample until the end of the turn. and Overwhelming Stampede, which gives Trample and +X+X, with X being the greatest power amongst creatures you control. Then we have Glorious Sunrise, an enchantment that gives you many options to choose from at the start of your combat, choosing from giving your creatures +1/+1 in Trample for the turn, letting a land tap for 3 green mana for the turn, drawing a card, provided you control a creature with power 3 or greater, or gaining 3 life. Though granted, most of the time you'll probably be either choosing to trample or draw with this. Then we have a handful of creatures that will give the rest of our creatures trample. Endray's Forerunners is a 7/7 boar with Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, and when it enters the battlefield, the other creatures we control will get +2/+2, Vigilance, and Trample until the end of the turn. Aggressive Mammoth is a trampling 8/8 elephant that gives our other creatures we control trample. And Stampeding Elk Herd is a 5/5 elk that gives our creatures trample, provided that when Stampeding Elk Herd attacks, the total power of creatures we control amounts to 8 or greater, which we should have most of the time when this is out. Up next is Nylea, God of the Hunt, a 6/6 indestructible god that isn't a creature provided your devotion to green is less than 5, though that will be quite rare given we're a mono green deck, but Nylea gives our other creatures we control trample. And mana can be pumped into Nylea to temporarily give a creature +2/+2. Shuriken Goreclaw is a 6/5 human bear with trample, and it gives our other creatures we control trample, and whenever non-token creatures enter the battlefield under our control, it gets a +1/+1 counter and haste for the turn. And finally we have Thunderfoot Baloth, a 5/5 beast with trample, and so long as you control your commander, Thunderfoot Baloth gets +2/+2, and other creatures we control get +2/+2 in trample. So, now that we have the ability to run over our opponent's creatures, let's look at some cards that will grant us other types of buffs for our creatures. First up we have Manifold Key, Key to the City, and Bellowing Tangleworm. Manifold Key and Key to the City can be used to make a creature unblockable for the turn, and Bellowing Tangleworm is a worm that has and gives green creatures we control Intimidate, meaning that they can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and creatures that share a color with it. Then we have Sylvan Anthem, Renata, Called to the Hunt, and Loyal Guardian. Sylvan Anthem gives green creatures we control +1/+1, and lets us scry 1 whenever a green creature enters the battlefield under our control. Renata is a demigod with power equal to our devotion to green, and has other creatures we control enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on them. And Loyal Guardian gives each of our creatures +1/+1 at the beginning of our combat phase, provided we control our commander. Then we have Crashing Drawbridge to give our creatures haste. Venom Connoisseur gains Death Touch until the end of the turn whenever another creature enters the battlefield under our control, and if this ability triggers a second time in a turn, all of our creatures gain Death Touch until the end of the turn. Dormant Grove starts as an enchantment that lets us put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control at the beginning of our combat. Then if that creature has toughness 6 or greater, Dormant Grove transforms into Gnarled Grovestrider, a 3/6 treefolk with vigilance that gives our other creatures vigilance. And while we have a handful of creatures with toughness 5 or greater, Radagast has a toughness of 5. So if you just want to transform Dormant Grove, you can just buff Radagast the combat after you've cast it. Then we have Prowling Serpapard, a 4/3 cat snake that can't be countered and makes it so our creature spells can't be countered. And finally, we have Vivian, Champion of the Wilds, a 4 loyalty planeswalker that's mostly here for its static and +1 abilities, the former letting us cast creature spells as though they had flash, and the latter giving a creature we control vigilance and reach until your next turn. Now, while Radagast's ability will help with keeping our hand full, we're still going to want a significant amount of card draw, as you won't always find a viable creature off of Radagast's ability, and we aren't only casting creatures. To start, we have Harmonize and Shamanic Revelation, the former having you draw 3 cards, and the latter drawing a card for each creature you control. Shamanic Revelation additionally gives you 4 life if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. Colossal Majesty has you draw at the beginning of your upkeep if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. Owlbear Shepherd is a 1/4 Goblin Druid that lets you draw at the beginning of your end step if creatures you control collectively have a power of 8 or greater. Then Lifecrafter's Bestiary lets you scry at the beginning of your upkeep before you draw, and additionally, you can pay an extra green whenever you cast a creature spell to draw a card. Then there's Sixth Sense and Keeper of Fables, with Sixth Sense being an aura that has you draw a card when the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, and Keeper of Fables is a 4/5 cat that lets you draw whenever 1 or more non-human creatures you control deal combat damage to a player. Then finally we have Primordial Sage and Soul of the Harvest, the former being a 4/5 spirit that lets you draw a card whenever you cast a creature spell, and the latter being a 6/6 trampling elemental that lets you draw whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control. And now that we have a fistful of cards, let's move on to our interaction and our protection spells. First up is a way to protect ourselves with Terrifying Presence, which prevents all combat damage dealt by creatures other than a target creature, letting you potentially take out an opponent's creature with a block while protecting yourself and your creatures. And then to protect our creatures we have Silk Guard, an X mana instant that lets you put a +1/+1 counter on up to X creatures you control. And then all modified creatures, auras, and equipment gain hexproof until the end of the turn. Now for some destroying effects we have Naturalize, Return to Nature, and Cankerbloom, each of which let us destroy a target artifact or enchantment. Return to Nature can also be used for a bit of graveyard hate, and Cankerbloom, itself a 3/2 Phyrexian fungus creature, can be used to proliferate. We also have Beast Within, an instant that lets us destroy a target permanent, though its controller gets a 3/3 green beast creature token. This is, however, one of the few decent ways that we can deal with creatures in mono green without having to resort to fight type effects. Speaking of which, we have Ram Through, Primal Might, and Azuri's Predation. Ram Through has a target creature you control deal damage equal to its power to a creature you don't control, and if your creature had Trample, any excess damage goes through to the opponent. Then Primal Might is an X mana cost sorcery that gives a target creature you control +X/+X for the turn, then has it fight a target creature you don't control, with fight meaning that the two creatures deal damage equal to their power to each other. And Azuri's Predation is a soft one-sided creature board wipe, which, when cast, has you make a 4/4 green Phyrexian beast for each creature your opponents control, and then it has your newly acquired beasts fight a different creature each. Depending on the size of the creatures your opponents control, this could wipe a large portion of their boards, and you get to keep all the Phyrexian beasts that survive their fight, so you could potentially have a pretty wide army once all the dust is settled. But now that we've gone through all of the spells in our deck, I'd like to quickly talk about the cards that do share creature types, as there were a few types that were difficult to avoid duplicates of. There's only a few examples, so you're unlikely to run into both cards of the same type in any given game, but it's good to be aware of them, and you may want to consider some of these cards when first looking to update or upgrade this deck. First up is Spirits, which has Kura the Bound in the Sky and Primordial Sage. Then there's Cats, with Prowling Serpapard and Keeper of Fables. Humans have an overlap with Venom Connoisseur and Surican Goreclaw. And finally, Druid has the most overlap with Venom Connoisseur, Owlbear Shepherd, and Llanowar Elves. Now let's take a quick look at our land base. As we're monocolored, mana fixing isn't going to be a huge issue for us, so we only have a few lands outside of basics. Starting with Rogue's Passage, which lets you make a creature unblockable for the turn. Oran Reef, the Vastwood, which can be used to give a +1/+1 counter to a green creature that entered the battlefield that turn. And Myriad Landscape, which can be sacrificed to tutor 2 basic lands onto the battlefield tapped. And, aside from those, we'll fill the rest of our decks with 32 forests. Now let's take a look at the price of this deck. And as you can see, at the time of recording, this deck costs right around $44, including the cost of basics at 10 cents each, though this wouldn't include the cost of shipping. Regardless, I'd like to go over a few potential upgrades you may wish to consider for this deck. To begin, you may wish for a few more no maximum hand size cards, as we currently only have one in this deck, so I'd suggest including Reliquary Tower and Thought Vessel. I'd also suggest considering Bow of Nylea, which gives your attacking creatures Death Touch, and while I don't normally recommend what to replace, I'd really suggest swapping Venom Connoisseur out for Bow of Nylea. Mostly since Bow of Nylea basically will do what Venom Connoisseur does, and Venom Connoisseur has overlapping creature types with 3 other cards in this deck, so its removal will make it just that little bit less likely that Radagast won't be able to find you a viable creature to put into your hand. Regardless, Tribute to the World Tree is a great addition in any green creature-based deck, either buffing creatures upon entering the battlefield or giving you some draw, and this deck is no exception. And if you're willing to add some more potential overlapping creature types, you may wish to consider Apex Altosaur, a 10/10 dinosaur, so overlapping with Galta, but it can be used to clear out an opponent's board. And Beast Whisperer is an elf druid, so again a bit of overlap there, that lets you draw whenever you cast another creature spell. Regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, play with, or upgrade this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like. And if you'd like more budget commander decks, consider dropping a sub. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.